All right, we left off on chapter 33. Pinmai and Yishan are trying to escape the Emperor's men, or just get out of the west side of the garden. Do you think we could hide behind that? Pinmai whispered right into Yishan's ear as she pointed to a large stone sculpture at the foot of the pavilion. I wonder if that's what that is. The sculpture, dark in the shadows, would hide them well, and it would place them close enough to hear everything. But it meant that they would have to run across the open pathway to get there. Yishan shrugged and gave her a doubtful motion with his hand. I don't know, he said to her with his eyes. You decide. They could both see the emperor and the king clearly now, both of them in the well-lit pavilion as if they were standing on a stage. The king was motioning towards a carved chest, and both turned as he began to open it. Now, she hissed into his ear and gave him a push. They dashed to the stone sculpture and crouched in its shadow. Had they been noticed? They heard a growl of laughter. Pinmai quaked and fought to stifle a shriek. Good try, King Kaijai, the emperor's voice said. The dragon's pearl is not the luminous stone, the king replied, and despite his formal tone, Pinmai could hear the devastation in his voice. The dragon's pearl is not the luminous stone. Oh, a luminous stone could be a dragon's pearl, the emperor laughed again. But this dragon's pearl is not a luminous stone. Pinmai and Yishan looked at each other in dismay. The dragon's pearl wasn't the luminous stone? Then what was the luminous stone? I do not understand, the king said. Ha! Maybe if you took a swim at the Crystal Palace at sea bottom, you could figure it out, the emperor chortled. But I doubt it. You are not as smart as you think. Well, I certainly am a fool compared with your exalted majesty, the king said in a dull, almost practiced tone. Liar, the emperor said. Admit it, you think yourself very clever because only you can read the paper of answers. Paper of answers. Pinmai sat up and almost gasped out loud. Did the king have a paper of answers? How could he? And what had the emperor meant about the Crystal Palace? Well, I'm not the only one who can read the paper of answers, the king said. Yes, the emperor said, and Pinmai could hear him waving his hand as if trying to swat a wasp. I know, immortals or those with great fortune or peace or whatnot can read it too, so you tell me. But because I cannot read it, you no doubt think that you are much wiser than me. Oh no, I would never, the king began. But you are not, the emperor continued, ignoring the king's protest. Answer me, have not all my questions to the paper confused you? Tortoises, mountains holding moons, and needles under the sea? I would not even pretend to understand what you're asking, the king replied. Except, of course, for your last question. Bah, last time was a wasted question, the emperor said with a snort of irritation. The paper obviously did not know the answer. The paper always knows, the king said immediately. Stories, the emperor said, dismissing the king's word. Only that word repeated over and over again. How could that be the secret to immortality? I even took the storyteller too, but for nothing, just a waste. Stories? Pinmai felt her thoughts swoop as if caught on the tail of a kite. The paper had told the emperor that the secret to immortality was stories, and that was why he had taken Ama. But Ama didn't know the secret of immortality, did she? However, that was the last time, the emperor said. The paper can attempt to redeem itself tonight. Yes, your exalted majesty, the king said. They heard a rustling, and the king stumbled. Careful, you fool, the emperor barked. Keep that accursed paper away from me. Yes, your exalted majesty, said the king. What is your question this time? Ask the paper, the emperor said, if I will achieve immortality, meaning if the king will be able to live forever. Pinmai heard the king shift, and both she and Yishan craned their necks to see him lean out of the pavilion, holding the paper over the frozen lake. Will the emperor achieve immortality? The king said in a loud voice. The full moon made a halo around his head, and only the soft reflected glow from the ice kept his face from being lost in shadow. What does it say? The emperor demanded. What does that line say? Pinmai watched the king gasp. The steam from his breath formed a silvery gray cloud that froze in the air. His eyes widened and his white hands tightened around the paper. It says, the king said in a strained tone, it says, yes. Do you guys believe him? Or do you think he's lying to keep the emperor happy? I can see in that situation being tempted to tell the emperor what I think he wants to hear. So I wonder what the paper really says. Chapter 34. Pinmai and Yishan stared at each other, their horrified faces mirroring. The emperor would be immortal? She would live forever? Oh, Pinmai felt like a snake had laid an egg in her stomach. How? The emperor said, the excitement palpable in his voice. When? Ask it when? Your exalted majesty, you know the paper answers only once, the king said. Yes, yes, the emperor said impatiently. Only one question and only in the light of the full moon, infernal thing. The wind, which had been silent, gave a weak whimper, as if too tired to even protest. Very well, I will wait, the emperor said, and in a more satisfied tone, what is another moon when I will have eternity anyways? The king did not reply. Pinmai twisted again to see him gazing bleakly at the shadows on the icy lake. Looking, she thought, as if he were seeing his own life of endlessly serving the emperor. The snow fell softly, tiny stars yielding their grasp on the sky. Meanwhile, I must make plans, the emperor muttered to himself. He straightened with a proud air. I will leave now, he said. You may stay here and do your thinking or whatever it is you always do. And with that, his heavy steps boomed as he exited the pavilion. Pinmai and Yishan pressed tightly against the stone statue, squeezing together. As he passed, a gust of icy air flew out and clawed at them, but he walked by, muttering without pause. With her one dared peek, Pinmai could see only an opulence of the golden silk, dragon robes, and black furs. They waited in silence, the emperor's figure getting smaller and smaller and smaller as he walked away, the snow slowly veiling him from view. When he finally disappeared, they waited for the king to depart as well. But the king didn't move. He just stood at the pavilion, perhaps watching the emperor as well. Finally, just when it looked as if Yishan was about to fall asleep from being so still, excuse me, the king suddenly stirred. His footsteps were not stomping powerful ones like the emperor's, but they too were weighted. They heard his steps come toward the sculpture, but instead of passing by, the steps stopped, and there was a long silence. Yishan and Pinmai looked at each other, puzzled. I know you are there, the king said. You might as well come out. Chapter 35. I remember Yenna saying if they get caught on the western side of the walkway, they'll be killed. I certainly hope that's not the case. Sorry I keep yawning. Must have been that only one cup of coffee I had today instead of two. How did you know we were here? Yishan said, as they crawled out from behind the statue. The king gave a sad, small smile, the lantern in his hand casting a dark shadow on his face. Well, this used to be my painting studio, he said, waving his hand at the pavilion. I know every branch and stone here. When I saw the shape of this shadow, I knew it was not right, even though I have not painted in a long time. Well, I imagine your ink would probably freeze right now, Yishan said, with a slight undertone of annoyance. Well, I stopped painting long before winter arrived, the king said. After I sent my son away, painting, it just lost all of its joy. We know about your son, Yishan said. Yana told us. The king frowned. Yana is a good girl, he said, but she has not yet learned restraint. Well, I think you could forgive her for that, Yishan said, considering she was running around the army camp for you pointlessly. Pointlessly? The king said, only the slightest question in his voice. No prisoners here, Yishan answered. Yenna said they've all been sent to the vast wall already. The king bowed his head, and his hand covered his brow. Then all is lost, he said, his eyes closing. What more can he take from me? Who? Yishan said. The emperor, of course, the king said. He shook his head in disgust and sighed, a sound low but filled with fury. He's not a beast. He's a beast, not a man. He could create a sea with all the blood that he has spilled and is still spilling. That vast wall is it's just a vast grave. What do you mean? Yishan asked. I am told, the king said, sagging like the winter branches weighted by snow, that the workers are treated worse than slaves, and the emperor has the fallen buried under the wall. Pinmai looked at him in horror. But Lady Meg's husband, Pinmai whispered. The king nodded, his head hanging with great grief. And now, he said in a voice that cracked, my own son. The wind blew a low, plaintive moan, the beginning note of a lamenting song. I knew it was a vain hope to look for my son, the king said, finally lifting his head. But I could not refuse Yenna's offer. I do hope she's safe. Yeah, me too, Pinmai said, and the king's eyes looked directly at her for the first time. I think I will soon be having the same wish for both of you as well, the king said, his shoulders straightening as if he were awakening. are you two children here? And that is going to be our stopping point for today.